Hi, everyone.
Hello. In the last segment, Ray lamented the lack of real-life experience of the governing body and indeed all the headquarters staff, the majority of whom are full-time workers either in pioneer work or circuit work or at the headquarters around the world for most of their lives, from youth onward. And we contrasted that with Scripture, where the leaders of Israel, Moses, David, even Christ, who was, yes, to be sure, a single man, but apparently was head of his family, taking care of many siblings as well as his mother in the real community of Nazareth for the first 30 years of his life. So he didn't go into Bethel at 19, like so many of we theocratic persons today are urged to do.
Or start pioneering.
The next segment is the next section of the discussion in the chapter Legalism, Opponent of Christian Freedom, is entitled Theocratic Law in Actual Application. It starts, the revised manual, to be called Correspondence Guidelines as it was turned over to me for editing, contained 13 pages on employment, a field of legislation into which the organization had not ventured previous to the 1950s. It began with the statement found elsewhere in the Watchtower publications that, quote, while an individual's employment can affect his standing in the congregation, it is not for us to tell anyone what kind of work he may or may not do.
This sounds nice, but in reality it simply means that while the organization cannot control or dictate a person's choice of employment, an obvious fact, it nevertheless may censure him for that choice, or even disfellowship him for choosing or continuing in an employment that the organization has ruled unacceptable. That is the way it works out in actual practice. The manual as submitted contains several pages of examples to illustrate the policy set out. Under the subheading, that's a long one, quote, work that is not itself unscriptural, but that links one with a wrong practice or makes one a promoter of it, end of quote. The manual supplies such examples as these.
Example. 2 women work as maids on a military base. One is employed in a home by a family, the husband of which is in the military. The other is a maid employed to clean the barracks. Comments. The first woman concludes that she could accept such work for the family and not be in conflict with Isaiah 2 verse 4, which speaks of beating one's swords into plowshares and not learning war anymore. She reasons that despite the location of her work and the fact that the breadwinner of the family is in the military, she is providing a common service for individuals in a home and is not employed by an organization in conflict with the Scriptures. She continues to be a member of the congregation, though if she sought the privilege of pioneer service, consideration might have to be given to how her employment is affecting others and whether she is viewed as a good example. The other woman, by her regular work, is performing a needed service in the accomplishment of the overall objectives of an organization, the purpose of which is out of harmony with Isaiah 2:4. She is paid by the military, works on military property, and is doing work regularly that makes her a part of that organization and its objectives. She is in conflict with Isaiah 2 verse 4.
End of the quote. Thus the first woman, who works domestically for a military man in his household on the base, can retain her standing in the congregation. The second, who cleans barracks, perhaps on the same base, cannot. As the rest of the manual and as all Watchtower publications make clear, anyone in conflict with Isaiah 2:4 is either to be disfellowshipped or pronounced disassociated. The first woman might be paid by an officer, even a general, who orders the men in the barracks into combat. Her pay comes from him, true, but the money comes from his military salary. Still, her work does not make her unclean. The second woman who cleans barracks because her pay comes from the military as an organization, and because she is somehow viewed as contributing to the overall objectives of the military, is counted as blood guilty and worthy of being cut off from the congregation.
Before we head on, there's a footnote dealing with this term disassociated, and the footnote says the use of the term disassociated came into being as a euphemism being used in place of disfellowshipped where sensitive issues such as entering the military, voting, or other such matters were involved. It later came to be used also of anyone who formally withdrew from the organization. Whichever term is used, the effect is the same, for disassociated persons today are treated the same as disfellowship persons. Ray goes on, it is difficult to conceive of more tortured reasoning and emphasis on technical distinctions than this. It is equally difficult not to see a parallel between such legalistic interpretations and those of Pharisaical and ancient rabbinical sources. Following this policy, a witness barber might set up a barber shop adjacent to a military base in an area where there were no nearby residences. All his customers might be soldiers whose pay comes from the military. He would not be judged guilty of violating 2 verse 4. But if he did the same barbering on the base for those same soldiers receiving pay from the military administration, he would, by this line of reasoning, be blood guilty, worthy of disfellowshipment. Such reasoning can only be termed Pharisaical. And I remember that in the case of my pioneering days in the 1970s, one of my roommates entered the police force, and it was apparently okay. He got advice in advance about the theocratic appropriateness of becoming a police officer, and was told it was fine. But then after he'd gone to the trouble of spending a year or more in training and becoming a police officer for, I think, about 2 years, suddenly the theocratic rule changed, and it was now judged inappropriate for anyone to carry a gun. So, of course, he had to resign from the police force. Which reminds us of the passage that Ray cites here, which is Matthew 23:16 to 22.
Which reads, "Woe to you, blind guides, who say, if anyone swears by the temple, it is nothing. But if anyone swears by the gold of the temple, he is under obligation. Fools and blind ones. Which in fact is greater, the gold or the temple that has sanctified the gold? Also, if anyone swears by the altar, it is nothing. But if anyone swears by the gift on it, he is under obligation. Blind ones. Which in fact is greater, the gift or the altar that sanctifies the gift? Therefore he that swears by the altar is swearing by it and by all the things on it. And he that swears by the temple is swearing by it and by him that is inhabiting it. And he that swears by heaven is swearing by the throne of God and by him that is sitting on it."
We're reminded that in this same chapter, Christ also criticizes the leaders for laying heavy burdens on the shoulders of men which they themselves are not willing to move. And that image is picked up in Acts chapter 15 at the Jerusalem Council about the law and its place, especially its place with Gentiles. And Peter makes the same point. He says, why are you laying on the brothers, the Gentile brothers, a weight that neither we nor our ancestors was able to bear?
So these things, what strikes me is that a person who has the mind of Scripture should be able to make a decision. But when you're a witness, or in the case of the Jews that wanted to be like the Pharisees, you have to kind of go home and see what the rule book says.
Yeah.
You can't just decide based on the principles of Scripture or the character of God. Justice, those things are eliminated. You have to go and see what what does the society allow right now?
Yeah.
So who are you loyal to?
Yeah. It's appropriate probably to make the comparison again with the training time for Jews under the law, the Levites themselves,
Mm-hmm.
who had to serve after the age of 25 or 30. So they were already mature men who already had some life experience and were already probably family men.
Mm-hmm.
It was assumed that they would be family men.
Mm-hmm.
So again, the contrast with the way we train in the theocracy men to be competent judges of other Christians who live normal lives.
Mm-hmm.
In the next segment, more legalistic technicalities.